Hey, humans. Jumping on the bandwagon is one of your most self-serving qualities, but I'm going to do it right now myself, because Squid Game is really hot, and there's been questions as to whether there's an American version or not. Well, why don't you follow the story of Abe Johnson as he struggles to survive in the games he's put in? This is Jumping the Bandwagon from a Different Perspective, and this is Stories from a Different Perspective by J.L. Sweeney, as imagined by Argus Truin. Volume 2, by the way. I am Argus Truin. Story number 8 of Volume 2, Musical Chairs. December 20th, 2067 AD, 8:55 p.m. Idaho State Penal Stadium, Lewiston, Idaho. Abe Johnson wiped the sweat from his face. This was the last one. One went away from his freedom. One went away from lifetime security for him and his family. He cleared his mind, focusing on what lay ahead. He shook it. This was the one he had feared the most. Many thought it was fixed. The state said it wasn't, but Abe knew that they were only given the information that the stadium owners wanted them to have. Still, he felt a degree of confidence wash over him as he looked around at his competition. Most of them were skinny, unhealthy white men. His gaze halted on a big Latino. Abe studied him for a few minutes before continuing his survey. Yes, the Latino would definitely be the most difficult. He finished his scouting and found his attention drawn back to the Latino. Glancing in his direction again, Abe found that the Latino was studying him. Abe nodded. The Latino continued to stare at him emotionlessly. Abe locked his eyes on the Latinos and began to picture the most horrible things imaginable happening to him. If he was punked, the Latino may think he had an advantage, and Abe couldn't afford any mistakes. The Latino continued to stare, and it dawned on Abe that he knew. This was Abe's last game. If he won, he would break the record. No convict was ever supposed to know what another's game record was, but the Latino knew. Abe realized that there was no mercy to be given here and wished hideous pain and torture upon the Latino man. Finally, the man nodded and turned his head away. Abe understood and spoke without ever uttering a word. It was also the Latino's last game. One of them would walk out of the stadium with 12 acres of land and a bank account full of money. The other would be dragged out by the heels and thrown into a dumpster that would transport his corpse to the city incinerator. 9 p.m. The iron gate opened and the men marched, single file, toward the center of the stadium. It was another sellout. Abe looked skyward at row after row of spectators. He smirked and shook his head. Those people paid $10,000 per spot. He supposed it was worth it if you could afford it. The majority could not. You could do everything you wanted from your pod. The personal observation deck was the Club Med of the gambling world. Food, sex, gambling, booze, drugs, prostitutes, and anything else you wanted, you name it, it was at your fingertips. Of course, only the rich could afford them. Poor folks had to watch on the pay-per-view networks that had taken over the world of television. Abe smiled. After tonight, he might just buy himself one. Spaces for 60,000 pods were situated at vantage points along the walls and ceilings. The higher up you were, the more money you paid. Full facilities of all sorts were no more than a touch away. In the uppermost pods, you could lie face down as if in bed and watch the games in comfort. They were made out of high-impact, shatterproof clear plastic. High-tech virtual reality contact lenses could take you directly into the middle of the games if you desired. It was the safest way to get as close to the carnage as possible. The men filed around a large circular disc planted in the ground, located in the middle of the stadium. At the sound of the gears turning, the men all faced the center of the circle. Panels slid back and 20 metal chairs began to slowly rise from beneath the disc. In just a few seconds, they were locked into place. On the back of each chair hung a numbered jersey. "Please place your contestant numbers on over your shirts," blared a voice over the loudspeakers. Abe looked at the chair in front of him and reached for the jersey. He picked it up and unfolded it. His had numerous bullet holes and blood stains on it. He pulled it on, feeling sickened by the smell of stale blood. All wagers must be placed in the next 30 seconds. The loudspeaker squawked again, and the men all faced left. Abe felt himself take an involuntary deep breath. This was it. He looked over his shoulder to find the Latino 4 men behind him and watching him closely. Abe pictured a knife slicing through the Latino's throat and his blood spraying across the front of his jersey. The Latino wore number 39. Abe wore 70. Wagers are now locked in. The game begins in 3, 2, 1. As the loudspeaker hit 1, music started and the pedestal that the chairs were on began to rotate counterclockwise. The men began marching clockwise. Abe was just starting to think about his strategy when the music stopped. The pedestal also stopped, and all of the men scrambled for a chair. Abe dove for one directly across from him and made it without any difficulty. Other men struggled and fought for a chair. A deafening boom shattered the air, and the man wearing the number 16 was hit in the chest by a phantom sniper rifle round. His body catapulted end over end to lie in a torn, bleeding heap almost 15 feet from where he had stood. Abe shook his head, but felt no real pity. If you were in the games, you'd either pissed off a politic or a gambler, or had committed some crime and gotten caught. Abe smirked again. The system was a joke. If you weren't rich, you never would be. Rich people had plenty of food along with everything else. His eyes narrowed as he thought of why he was here. He had not been able to get a job, and his mother's paycheck, which barely covered the rent, was not enough to feed a family of 6. He had been invited by 3 other young men to go on a food heist. All he had wanted was a couple of loaves of bread for his brothers and sisters. They had all been caught. The other 3 had already died in the games. They hadn't been all that big or athletic. Abe was lucky in that respect. At 20 years old, Abe stood 6'5" and was a trim 185 pounds. Perhaps a little thin, but he made up for it in strength and power. He was extremely fast and agile. The music started again. The Idaho State Penal Stadium was unlike any other stadium ever built. It was the first of its kind, and there were many more in various stages of development now. It was a huge dome covering 14 acres of wooded area and a small row of hills. At the center was the musical chairs pedestal. Along the west-facing wall was the kickball field, while on the east-facing wall was the dodgeball court. The first game he had participated in was hide and seek. It was played in the area where he now battled for his life and his freedom. Abe recalled drawing numbered tiles with 21 other men. They would play until only 7 remained. Those surviving 7 would move on to the other games. Abe had drawn number 4. The man who had drawn number 1 was a big Hawaiian man. He had looked pretty dangerous to Abe, and that had proven to be true. He had gotten 3 men in the first round. Hide and seek was played in an extremely unconventional manner. The basic rules remained the same, with one exception. The convict, who was it, carried a taser dialed up to a lethal voltage. One touch from that, and a player was instantly fried. Players were given 2 minutes to scatter into the wooded area of the stadium. Once the it player began the hunt, the idea was to elude and make it back to the base for another round or die. The next player in the tile drawn order that had survived became it. This lasted until only 7 were left. Gamblers would bet incredible amounts on the numbered convicts, hoping that their player would make it to the final 7. Abe thought back to how the big Hawaiian had quickly zapped numbers 2, 3, and 20. Number 20 had almost made it, but the Hawaiian had been faster. He was only a few steps away from the base when the Hawaiian grabbed his jersey from behind and dragged him down, ramming the taser into his back and grinning while the poor man's insides were baked. Abe had been it next and had caught 2 people, a small Asian man and a white man. The game had ended after 4 rounds, and Abe had survived. Now the music was playing again, and he moved smoothly toward each oncoming chair. The music ceased again, and a chair came to a stop between Abe and a white man with long, dirty hair wearing the number 11. The man was closer and lunged for the chair. Abe grabbed a fistful of his hair and jerked him backwards. Hair ripped from the man's head, and he screamed as Abe ran past him to sit in the chair. The phantom boomed again, and most of number 11's head disappeared in a red mist. His body flopped to the ground near Abe, splashing drops of blood onto Abe's boots. Abe took a deep breath and tried to block the image from his mind. He tried to force himself to imagine a sunny afternoon on the beach, but other, more horrible images replaced that of number 11's death. Number 22's pleading eyes resurfaced in his memory. Kickball had been 2 weeks after hide and seek. He was 14th in a line of 30 men that were led into an arena where a kickball field had been built. It was the size of a regulation softball field. The game was played by normal kickball rules, with a few exceptions. Peg-outs were the only method of gaining an out. The player pegged would be shot by a phantom and dragged off the field. It was a game to 30 points. If at any time a team fell behind by 20 points, they were all shot. Abe had gotten number 22 in a rundown. 30 had picked up the ball and had taken a hasty shot at 22, who had easily ducked out of the way. The ball had bounced into Abe's hands. He drew his arm back to throw when 22 looked him straight in the eye and shouted, "Please don't kill me, oh God, please don't kill me." Abe looked into the man's face and felt pity, and for a moment he froze. "Throw the motherfucker!" came a loud, deep voice from behind him, and he automatically cut loose. The ball bounced off of 22's right shoulder. He gave Abe a sad look right before the booming of the phantom obliterated his head. Abe was sprayed with the blood, bone, and bits of flesh. He shook a little as he wiped the gore off of his face. He would pity the others later. Right now he had to win. Abe's team had won 30-19. There were only 6 on his team left. The other team had 5. Abe had tallied up 4 kills. His total was 6, and unknown to him, heavier bets were beginning to be placed on him. His next event, dodgeball, wouldn't be for another month, yet people were scrambling to get a part of his action. One man had even bet $1 million that Abe would make it to musical chairs. The music stopped again, and Abe tripped the red-haired man wearing number 7. 7 fell, but 13 was making for the chair nearest Abe. Abe took 3 large strides and backhanded 13, knocking him down. Abe jumped into the chair and watched as 7 and 13 fought for the last chair. 13 seemed to be getting the upper hand until 7 bit his arm. 13 jerked away and 7 let go at the same time. 13 fell, and the redhead took the chair. 13 started to stand, looking at Abe. He began to say something, but was cut off when the phantom blew a hole the size of a cantaloupe out of the middle of him. Organs began to dangle in the hole, and he wobbled a little. He took a step towards Abe, then went down on his knees. He had a surprised look on his face and glanced down when something dropped out of his wound and landed wetly on the ground. He fell face first, still staring at Abe. Again the music began, and again Abe fought to get a chair. 4 more times he gouged eyes, pulled hair, punched, kicked, bit, choked, and slapped to get one of the remaining spots. His ears rang with the sound of the phantom, and his clothes were splattered with the remains of those who also fought to survive, but didn't. There were 8 men left. There was only 1 man left between Abe and the Latino. It felt like he was fighting every time. He took a deep breath and felt exhaustion beginning to creep over him. Abe's value was way up by the time dodgeball rolled around. Bets came in around the clock, both for and against him. If only he knew. He had been issued his number and a pair of steel mesh gloves. 10 minutes later, his team of 20 went to the dodgeball field. They filed along the back wall, 65 feet from the center of the court. Another team was just entering the opposite side, 20 on each side, glaring at the men standing across from them, trying to prepare themselves for the carnage that was about to take place. 10 metal balls, covered with spikes and blades, were placed at intervals along the line at center court. The loudspeaker began a countdown, and at 1, several men from both sides sprinted toward the balls. Abe had been one of them. He had his eyes on the ball that was directly in front of him and felt that he had the steps on his opponent. He skidded to a stop and grabbed the ball, careful not to cross the center line. The line had a passive laser sensor that would cause the foul alarm to be triggered. Offenders received the gift of the phantom. Abe quickly examined the ball in his hand. It was a sphere about 7 inches in diameter, completely covered with spikes and blades of varying length, some serrated. It was a lot lighter than it looked, and he had no doubt that when someone was struck by one of these balls, it would cause some lethal damage. He grimaced, noticing the dried blood and small bits of skin still attached to some of the blades. He fought down his revulsion to this perverse game and looked for the nearest opponent. Number 86, the guy who had been running toward the ball Abe now held, was turning to escape. Abe made the first throw of the game, putting all he had into it and watching as it hit 86 in his right lower back. There was a dull thud as it stuck, followed by the man's horrible screaming. Abe didn't know it, but the assorted gamblers had just won over $200 million on his throw. Abe retreated toward the back of the court, fighting with himself to suppress the sorrow he was feeling, watching as number 86's teammates ripped the ball out of his back and continued playing. Men began falling on both sides as the 10 balls zipped back and forth across the line. A man a few yards to the left of Abe went running after a loose ball that was just across the line on their side. He didn't see two of his opponents baiting the trap. Abe started to warn him, but stopped. The man reached the ball and, grinning, stood, noticed the 2 men running at him, and threw his ball. It flew nicely, shredding the thigh of one of his attackers who fell. The other kept coming. The man felt fear and turned to run away. He made it several feet before a ball smacked into the back of his head. He staggered and fell, convulsing. Abe wrenched the ball out of the back of the man's head, and the man rolled over and grabbed his arm. Abe's heart nearly stopped. The man gurgled something at him, choking on the blood that was now filling his mouth, then died. Abe threw the ball. He got another and threw it. His arm was beginning to ache. An opponent close to the line threw a ball at Abe's feet. He deflected it with his gloves and heard a scream as it tore into another man behind him. The game was over in 12 minutes, but it had felt like an hour. Bodies were everywhere. You couldn't walk across the court without stepping in blood, or something else. Abe and 12 of his team were still alive. The other team had been reduced to 5, where the game was considered a victory. Abe looked over at number 86, the first man he had hit. His eyes were just now glazing over. He had not died instantly, instead, bleeding out as he watched the entire game. Abe was gasping for breath. 3 men left, and he had fought every single time. He had just broken the neck of number 15 to get to one of the last 3 chairs. Abe, the Latino, and the short, wiry, red-haired man wearing number 7 glared at each other, waiting for the music to start again. When it did, Abe prayed that he was ready. The chairs began to move, and the music screamed out of the loudspeakers. The men jumped up and began stalking the chairs as they rotated. Every heartbeat pounded in his chest. Breathing was painful, but he kept at it. He was too close to the end to give up. He neared one of the last 2 chairs, watching as the redhead took a casual step toward it. Then he knew. He knew that all of the musical chairs contestants had been against him from the start. He knew that there must be unbelievable amounts of money being bet against him. He knew that he was not going to fall to the Phantom. The music stopped and the redhead dove for the chair. Abe quickly glanced at the Latino, who was smiling as he sat easily into one of the 2 remaining chairs. The redhead was stepping up onto the pedestal when Abe grabbed his arm, whirling him off the platform, but losing his own balance in the process. The redhead was quick and was running for the chair again. Abe tackled him, and they began wildly throwing punches at each other. The man drove his head upward into Abe's face, headbutting him, opening a huge gash where his left eyebrow had just been. Blood poured into his eye as he smashed his fist again and again into the redhead's face. Abe barely heard the man's pleas as his punches broke teeth and finally shattered the man's nose. Abe felt the redhead's body go limp, so he dropped him and swayed his way to the last chair. He slumped into it and heard the report of the Phantom. He had heard talk of the games being fixed, but hadn't wanted to really believe it. Every man who joined the games wanted only one thing: to win and get out of prison. He knew that the stadium officials kept win-kill records and that gamblers bet more on the convicts who had more kills. They were the ones most likely to survive to musical chairs, where the biggest prize and the biggest bets were to be had. Freedom, land, a bank account with $500,000, and a clean record were the rewards for winning musical chairs. Hundreds of millions of dollars were bet on the contestants who made it that far. gamblers knew that at this stage of the games, a man would do anything to stay alive. This was the level where you could see a man turn into a savage animal, brutally slaying everything else in order to live. One winner per year. Only 20 convicts per year got the opportunity to win at musical chairs. The rest of them spent the time qualifying in the other games or rotting in their cells. Thousands of men had been in prison for years before even getting a chance at the games. Chances were that you would get killed, but that was better than spending your life in these types of prisons. Prisons of the past were gone. There weren't any law libraries or weight rooms. Convicts lived in 8 by 8 by 8 foot coffins. The toilet was an open drainage pipe that ran through the entire complex. Food was nothing more than a slop line. Guards with phantom sniper rifles patrolled the 100-foot-high walls. Prison gangs ruled the area. You either became a soldier or a bitch. No one came to visit. If you were there, you were screwed. The owner of a professional football team, Joseph Stovins, saw potential and proposed the idea in June of 2055. Stovins offered to buy the land and build the stadium. He presented the idea to the state government. Government also saw the potential and accepted Stovins' offer after a year of haggling over percentages. The papers were finally signed on July 11, 2056, and ground for the Idaho State Penal Stadium was broken in Lewiston, Idaho on March 14, 2057 AD, with construction being completed nearly 3 years later. The first game started December 1 of 2060. In the beginning, there was only kickball, with the winners receiving suspended sentences. The other games in the current system for winners were added in January of 2062. Hundreds of billions of dollars had exchanged hands in the 7 years since the games had been running. Hundreds of millions of dollars were now being bet on Abe, who, at the beginning of the day, was not even aware that he was only a few kills away from the record. Farron Thomas had been the first winner of musical chairs. In December of 2063, a rapist, set free to once again prey upon the public. He had received his freedom, the land, and the money. This news was, of course, broadcast to the prisoners, having the desired effect of making them fight as fiercely as possible. Private bettors came away with over $60 million. Idaho State gleaned a cool $20 million, and Stovins netted $10 million himself. 79 convicts had died. Some were only minor drug dealers, while others were murderers and armed robbers. One had been a political prisoner who had voiced his opinion one too many times and had questioned authority too often. The first televised games had opened up another market, and though there were those who called it vile and barbaric, the revenue from the games overrode any serious complaints. He wasn't sure, but it seemed like the music had not started for at least 5 minutes. He was grateful for the break. He was sweating heavily and his eye throbbed. He knew that he would have to kill the Latino outright. Any longer than a couple of minutes of combat, and he knew that he would die. He wondered who wanted him to die so badly that they could fix this game. It had finally dawned on him when he was fighting the redhead that most of these convicts had been against him the whole time. He wasn't exactly sure how many, but he knew that the Latino had been saved for last. Abe smirked. He wondered what each man had been offered had they gotten the chance to kill him. He looked at the bodies ringing the pedestal, smelled the blood and feces, heard the chants of the gamblers, and suddenly felt a surge of energy well up inside him. They were chanting his name. Abe smiled. He wasn't about to let them down. He took a deep breath and stood up. The chair lowered into the pedestal and the music began to play. The pedestal began its slow rotation, and Abe realized that the music was almost deafening. He began marching around the pedestal, listening to the music drone on and on. He was tired, and the music kept playing, making it hard to focus. He was on the opposite side of the chair when the music stopped. With his ears ringing, it took him a second to realize that it was quiet. He started to sprint, but saw that the Latino was already standing in front of the chair. Abe slowed to a trot, then a walk. The Latino was nodding at him. He stopped in front of him, and the Latino motioned to the dome. "We don't give them the pleasure." Abe nodded once and lunged into the Latino's face. his fist smashing into the man's Adam's apple. He fell down and Abe kicked him in the back as he rolled away. Abe kicked him again, this time in the head, and then again in the ribs. Blood leaked from the corners of the Latino's mouth, and as he started to rise, Abe, almost completely exhausted, drew back and kicked the man in the crotch as hard as he could. Blood and puke sprayed from the man's mouth, and he began to tumble forward. Abe stepped around behind him and quickly snapped his neck. Letting the body drop, he went and stood in front of the last chair. Looking upward, he heard the roar of spectators, heard them chanting his name. He waved once. Hearing the roaring increase, then, with tears running silently down his cheeks, he flopped into the last chair. The stadium was almost shaking with the cheering, and with some booing from those poor sports who had lost money on Abe. Stovins, the state governor, and the Lewiston mayor entered from an elevator that led to the owner's box. They carried a gold-plated trophy featuring a man in a chair at the top. Around the lower tier were a kickball, a dodgeball, and a taser, also gold-plated. His name, the date, and his kills record were on a plaque on the front. Stovins handed him the trophy. The state governor handed him his pardon. The mayor handed him a check and the deed to a small tract of land in northern Idaho. Abe held tightly to the three things in his arms. He couldn't speak. Didn't want to. All he could think of was the fact that now he would be able to take care of his family. Musical Chairs, written in 2013, the American version of Squid Game. There you have it! Good luck to you humans. Good luck to me. Share and like if you like it. Later.